The October rain fell soft and steady over the military cemetery, each drop darkening the granite headstones that marked the final resting places of those who had served. The sky hung low and gray, the kind of overcast that seemed to press down on the living with the weight of all the sorrows the dead had carried. At the far edge of the grounds, beneath an ancient oak whose branches stretched like skeletal fingers toward heaven, a small gathering of mourners stood in a semicircle around a flag-draped coffin. Jack Harrison stood at attention, his right hand resting gently on his son's shoulder as the Marine Honor Guard raised their rifles. The seven sharp cracks of the salute echoed across the cemetery, startling a crow from its perch in the oak tree. Jack's jaw tightened with each shot, his military bearing evident in the straight line of his spine, the squared set of his shoulders. 8 years in the Navy had taught him how to stand through difficult moments, how to keep his face neutral, even when his heart was breaking. Beside him, 9-year-old Danny Harrison watched the ceremony with eyes too old for his face. The boy had his mother's clear blue eyes and his father's stubborn chin, a combination that reminded Jack every day of what he had lost and what he still had to protect. Danny's small hand gripped his father's jacket, his knuckles white with tension, as he tried to stand as straight and strong as the man beside him. The honor guard began their precise choreographed folding of the American flag. Each movement was deliberate, practiced 1,000 times until it became muscle memory. The flag that had covered Sergeant Frank Harrison's coffin was transformed through their careful hands into a tight triangle, stars facing outward, a geometric representation of a nation's gratitude. The lead Marine, a young man barely 25 with the weathered face of someone who had seen combat, approached Jack with slow, measured steps. On behalf of the President of the United States, the Commandant of the Marine Corps, and a grateful nation, please accept this flag as a symbol of our appreciation for your grandfather's faithful and dedicated service. The Marine's voice carried across the small gathering, strong despite the emotion that threatened to crack it. He extended the folded flag to Jack, who accepted it with both hands, cradling it against his chest like something sacred. Jack looked down at the flag, feeling the weight of it, the texture of the fabric beneath his fingers. Somewhere in his memory, he could hear his grandfather's voice, rough with age, but still carrying the authority of a man who had led others through hell and brought them home. A man's worth isn't in his bank account, Jack. It's in what he builds and who he protects. The small crowd began to disperse as the ceremony concluded. Jack counted them silently. 12 people. That was all who had come to honor a man who had served his country in war and innovation alike. A handful of elderly veterans, their backs bent, but their salutes crisp and military sharp. A young minister who had never met Frank, but spoke the standard words about sacrifice and service. Sarah Mitchell, the librarian from Danny's school, standing with her 12-year-old daughter, Emma, both of them holding umbrellas against the light rain. A few of Jack's co-workers from Miller's auto shop, uncomfortable in their Sunday clothes, not quite sure what to say to a man who had just buried his grandfather. And no one from the Hartley family. Not William Hartley, who had been married to Jack's late wife, Claire. Not Richard or Patricia Hartley, Claire's parents, who lived in a mansion 30 miles away and had more money than they could spend in 3 lifetimes. Not even a card. Not even flowers. Danny tugged at his father's sleeve as the crowd thinned. "Dad, why didn't Grandpa Hartley come? Or Grandma Patricia?" The boy's voice was quiet, but the question carried an edge of confusion that cut deeper than anger would have. Jack knelt down until he was eye level with his son, his knees sinking slightly into the wet grass. He looked into those blue eyes so much like Claire's and chose his words carefully. Some men choose money over family, son. Some men forget what really matters. He smoothed down Danny's collar, straightened the small black tie that the boy had worn for the first time today. "But you don't need to worry about them. We're Harrisons. We take care of our own." Danny nodded slowly, processing this information the way he processed everything, with a seriousness that made Jack's heart ache. Great-Grandpa Frank fought over this country. He deserved better than 12 people at his funeral. "He did," Jack agreed, standing up and placing the folded flag carefully under his arm. "But he would have been proud of you today. Standing tall, being strong, that's what Marines do." As the last of the mourners drifted toward the parking lot, the minister approached Jack with a small wooden box. The man's hands were soft, uncalloused, the hands of someone who had never held anything more dangerous than a hymnal. "Mr. Harrison, the funeral home asked me to give you this. It was among your grandfather's personal effects. Jack took the box, feeling the weight of it, the smooth grain of the wood against his palm. It was maybe 6 inches on each side, simple craftsmanship, no decoration except for a small brass clasp. Thank you, Minister, for the service. The minister nodded, his generic sympathy already fading as he thought about his next appointment, his next funeral, his next wedding. He walked away through the rows of headstones, leaving Jack and Danny alone beneath the oak tree with the flag and the box and the fresh earth that covered Frank Harrison's grave. Jack opened the clasp with his thumb. Inside, nested in faded red velvet, lay his grandfather's Purple Heart medal, the bronze star catching what little light filtered through the clouds. Beside it was a photograph creased and faded with age, showing a young man in Marine Corps dress blues, rifle in hand, standing in front of a canvas tent with 4 other Marines. Jack recognized his grandfather's face, younger by 50 years, but still unmistakable in the set of the jaw, the direct stare into the camera lens. Beneath the medal in the photograph was a sealed envelope, yellowed with time, with Jack's name written across the front in his grandfather's precise mechanical handwriting. The letters were formed with the careful deliberation of a man who had learned his penmanship in a different era when such things mattered. Jack slid the envelope into his jacket pocket without opening it. Some things were meant to be read in private, not standing in a cemetery with his 9-year-old son watching his every move, trying to be brave, trying not to cry. They walked together toward the parking lot where Jack's Ford F-150 waited, old and dented but reliable. The truck was a 1998 model with over 280,000 miles on the odometer, rust eating at the wheel wells. The paint faded to a color that might once have been blue, but now looked like the sky before a storm. It was the kind of vehicle that announced its owner's financial situation to anyone who cared to look, and Jack had long ago stopped caring what people thought about his truck, or his clothes, or his situation. The rain picked up as they climbed into the cab, shifting from a gentle drizzle to a steady downpour that drummed against the metal roof and obscured the world outside the windshield. Jack sat behind the wheel without starting the engine, letting the sound of the rain fill the silence between them. Danny sat in the passenger seat, his feet barely reaching the floor mat, his small hands folded in his lap. "Tell me again about great-grandpa Frank," Danny said quietly, "about when he taught you to fix the radio." Jack smiled despite the weight in his chest, despite the fresh grave behind them and the uncertain future ahead. He could see it clearly in his memory, as vivid as if it had happened yesterday instead of 29 years ago. He had been 8 years old, the same age Danny was now, and his grandfather had called him into the workshop behind the old farmhouse. "I was about your age," Jack began, his voice soft, almost dreamlike with remembering. "Your great-grandpa had this old radio, a big wooden one from the 1940s. It didn't work anymore. The tubes were burned out, the wiring was corroded, the whole thing looked like junk. But he said it could be fixed, that anything broken could be made whole again if you understood how it worked and had the patience to do the job right." Danny leaned closer, hanging on every word the way he always did when Jack talked about Frank. "He took that radio apart piece by piece," Jack continued, "and he showed me each component, explained what it did, how electricity moved through the circuits like water through pipes. He had these hands, Danny, big hands, scarred and calloused from years of work, but so gentle when he handled those delicate tubes and wires. He said a man's worth wasn't in his bank account. It was in what he built and who he protected." "Did you fix it?" Danny asked. "The radio. We did. Took us 3 weeks, working an hour every evening after dinner. When we finally got it working, when sound came crackling out of those old speakers, your great-grandpa just smiled and nodded like he knew all along that we could do it. Then he turned it to a classical music station, and we sat there listening to Beethoven while the sun went down outside the workshop window." Danny was quiet for a moment, thinking. Then he said, "I wish I could have known him better. I was too little to remember much." "He knew you, though," Jack said, reaching over to ruffle his son's hair. "He used to say you had the same spark he saw in me when I was young. The same curiosity, the same stubborn refusal to accept that something was impossible just because other people said so." Jack started the engine and pulled out of the cemetery parking lot, the windshield wipers beating a steady rhythm against the rain. They drove in silence through the gray streets of Asheville, past the closed factories and struggling businesses that marked the economic reality of their corner of North Carolina. The neighborhoods got progressively more worn as they approached the apartment complex where they lived the American dream, looking more threadbare with each passing block. Their building was a three-story structure from the 1970s, built with the kind of cheap materials and optimistic assumptions about maintenance that meant it was already falling apart 40 years later. The parking lot was cracked asphalt with more potholes than smooth surface, and the exterior paint had faded to a uniform gray that matched the overcast sky. Jack parked in his assigned spot, number 17, beneath a light fixture that had been broken for 3 months and would probably stay broken for 3 more. The apartment was on the second floor, unit 2B, and Jack's legs were heavy as he climbed the exterior staircase with Danny following close behind. The metal steps rang hollow under their feet, and somewhere above them, a door slammed, followed by the sound of muffled arguing. Jack tried not to think about how much he hated this place, how every day here felt like failure, how the walls seemed to close in a little tighter each month. He unlocked the door and stepped into the small living room that also served as dining room and Danny's play area. The apartment was clean because Jack made sure it would clean military standards applied to civilian life, but cleanliness couldn't hide the worn furniture and the walls that needed painting and the general air of making do with less than enough. There was a couch from Goodwill, its cushions sagging in the middle, a small television on a stand made from cinder blocks and a board, a card table with 2 folding chairs where they ate their meals. Jack had set the wooden box with his grandfather's medal on the kitchen counter and hung his wet jacket on a hook by the door. Danny disappeared into a small bedroom, the one with the window that looked out onto the parking lot and the sound of traffic from the highway beyond. Jack could hear the boy changing out of his funeral clothes, the rustle of fabric, the small sounds of a 9-year-old navigating grief, in the only way he knew how, by focusing on the next task the next moment. Jack moved to the kitchen table where a stack of bills waited, accusatory in their bright white envelopes and red stamp that screamed past due and final notice. He sat down heavily and began to sort through them, a ritual he performed every few days as if shuffling the papers might somehow change the numbers printed on them. Medical bills from Claire's final months. The cancer had been aggressive, the treatments expensive, and even with insurance, the out-of-pocket costs had been devastating. $52,000 in remaining debt spread across 3 different collection agencies, each one sending threatening letters about legal action and credit destruction. The rent notice from the apartment management informing him that the monthly rate was increasing from $1,550 to $1,850 effective next month, take it or leave. The utility companies, the phone company, the car insurance, the endless parade of obligations that define modern American poverty. Jack pulled a small notebook from the drawer and did the math he had done 100 times before. His checking account held $418. His savings account held exactly $0 because he had emptied it to pay for Frank's funeral. The military burial plot had been free courtesy of his grandfather's service, but the casket and the service and the small reception afterwards had cost money they didn't have. Jack's monthly salary from Miller's Auto Shop was $2,800 after taxes. The bills in front of him totaled $4,300, and that was just for this month, not counting the medical debt that hung over them like a storm cloud that would never pass. The sound of footsteps in the hallway outside made Jack look up, and then came the knock on the door, firm and insistent. He knew who it was before he opened it. Patricia Hartley stood in the corridor wearing a cream-colored coat that probably cost more than Jack made. In 3 months, her silver hair perfectly styled, her makeup flawless even in the harsh fluorescent light of the apartment building. Behind her through the open door, Jack could see a black Mercedes sedan idling in the parking lot with a driver behind the wheel. "Jack," she said, her voice carrying the practiced warmth of someone who had learned to fake sincerity for social occasions. "May I come in?" Jack stepped aside without speaking, and she entered the apartment with the careful steps of someone navigating a foreign country. Her eyes took in everything, the worn furniture, the small kitchen, the bills on the table, and Jack could see the calculation happening behind her polite smile. This was ammunition. This was proof of what she had been saying for 3 years, that Jack Harrison was not fit to raise a child, that Daniel would be better off with people who could provide proper opportunities. "I wanted to express my condolences," Patricia said, though her tone suggested she was following a script rather than expressing genuine emotion. "Frank was a good man in his way." "He was a great man," Jack corrected, his voice flat. "He served his country in Vietnam. earned a Purple Heart, came home and worked for DARPA inventing technology that could have saved lives. Patricia waved her hand dismissively as if Frank's accomplishments were minor details that didn't deserve serious consideration. Yes, well, that brings me to why I'm here. Richard and I have been discussing Daniel's situation. Jack felt something cold settle in his stomach. Danny doesn't have a situation. He has a father who loves him and a home. Does he? Patricia looked pointedly at the bills on the table at the apartment that was too small and too shabby to hide its inadequacies. Jack, you're a good man, I don't doubt that. But you're struggling, we can see that. The medical debts, the late rent, the wow that barely covers expenses. This isn't the life Claire would have wanted for her son. Don't talk about Claire, Jack said, his voice dropping to something dangerous. Don't you dare use her to justify whatever you're planning. Patricia had the grace to look slightly uncomfortable, but she pressed on with the determination of someone who believed absolutely in the rightness of her cause. Richard and I can provide opportunities you never could. Private school, college fund, tutors, music lessons, a proper home in a safe neighborhood. Everything a bright boy like Daniel deserves. What Daniel deserves, Jack said slowly, carefully, is to grow up with his father, in a home where he's loved, not just provided for. Love doesn't pay for education, Jack. Love doesn't guarantee a future. Is that why you came here the day I bury my grandfather, to tell me I'm not good enough to raise my own son? Patricia's face hardened slightly, the polite mask slipping to show the steel underneath. I came here to give you a choice. Work with us, let Daniel spend more time with us, prepare him for the transition. Or we'll pursue legal options. We have resources, Jack. We have lawyers who specialize in custody cases. We have evidence of your financial instability. We have documented proof that this apartment is barely suitable for a child. Get out, Jack said quietly. Jack, be reasonable. Think about what's best for Daniel, not your pride. I said get out. Jack walked to the door and opened it, standing aside with the kind of rigid control that came from years of military discipline. And Patricia, the next time you want to talk about my son, you can do it through a lawyer, my lawyer. Patricia gathered her coat around herself with wounded dignity and walked to the door. She paused in the threshold and looked back at him with something that might have been genuine concern if you didn't know her better. You're making a mistake, Jack. We'll see what the courts have to say about a mechanic raising a child in poverty. She left her heels clicking on the metal stairs, and Jack closed the door with enough force to rattle the frame. He stood there for a long moment, his forehead pressed against the cool wood, trying to control the anger that threatened to overwhelm his reason. Behind him, he heard Danny's bedroom door open quietly. I heard, the boy said simply. Jack turned around and saw his son standing in the hallway, still wearing the church clothes from the funeral, but with his tie loosened and his shirt untucked. Danny's face was serious, older than 9, old enough to understand exactly what Patricia's visit had meant. They can't take me away from you, can they, Dad? Jack crossed the room and knelt down in front of his son, taking both of Danny's hands in his own. Listen to me, Danny. I made your mother a promise when she was in the hospital. She made me swear that I wouldn't let her family take you, that you needed your father, not their money. I've never broken a promise to your mother, and I'm not starting now. But what if they have lawyers? What if the judge says we're too poor? Then we'll find a way to fight back, Jack said firmly, because you're worth fighting for. You're worth everything. Danny threw his arms around his father's neck and held on tight, and Jack hugged him back, feeling the weight of responsibility settle across his shoulders like the flag he had received at the cemetery. Somewhere in the kitchen, his grandfather's Purple Heart sat in its wooden box, a reminder of other battles fought and won against impossible odds. That night, after Danny had finally fallen asleep on the couch with a worn blanket pulled up to his chin, Jack sat at the kitchen table and opened the envelope his grandfather had left him. His hands were steadier than he expected as he unfolded the single sheet of paper, though his heart was beating faster. The letter was written in Frank's careful handwriting, each word formed with precision, the way a man wrote when he knew these might be the last words his grandson would ever hear from him. Jack, it began. If you're reading this, I'm gone. There are things you need to know, things I should have told you years ago but didn't, because I thought I was protecting you. I was wrong. The truth is always better than comfortable lies, even when it hurts. What you inherited isn't just a farmhouse and 15 acres of land. It's something more important and more dangerous. In my workshop behind the false wall where I kept the good tools, there's a safe. The combination is your mother's birthday month, day, year. Inside that safe, you'll find documents that will change everything you thought you knew about me, about my service, and about the people who destroyed my life's work. I worked for DARPA from 1971 to 1974, developing advanced battery technology for military use in Vietnam. The project was called Eternal Power, and it could have saved hundreds of lives. Men died in field hospitals because we couldn't keep the equipment running far from supply lines. My invention would have solved that, but it was killed, buried, destroyed. Not because it didn't work, but because it worked too well. William Hartley was a major in Army intelligence during Vietnam. He never saw combat, never got his boots muddy, but he made connections. When my project threatened oil company profits, those connections were activated. Hartley recommended that the Pentagon shut us down. He said it was about national security, about strategic petroleum management. The truth was simpler and uglier. He was protecting his family's business interests. They forced me to sign a non-disclosure agreement. They threatened to court-martial me for theft of government property if I didn't surrender my patents and walk away. They offered me $50,000 as severance, told me to retire early, keep my mouth shut, and be grateful I wasn't in prison. I took the money because I had a family to protect. Your grandmother was sick. Your mother was in college. I couldn't risk losing everything. For 50 years, I've lived with that decision. For 50 years, I've watched men like Hartley profit from technology I invented, while soldiers continue to die because the equipment they needed couldn't be powered in remote locations. That burden is mine. But the evidence is yours now. In the safe, you'll find everything. The original patents, the correspondence with DARPA, the recordings I made of Hartley's threats, the working prototype I hid before they destroyed the lab. This technology still works, Jack. It's still revolutionary, and it's still being suppressed. I waited too long. I was too afraid. I chose safety over justice, and I've regretted it every day since. But you're stronger than I was. You have your mother's courage and your father's honor. Make them pay, Jack. Not for me, but for every soldier who died because corrupt men chose oil profits over American lives. Trust David Mitchell. His father, Tom Mitchell, was my sergeant in Vietnam. Tom died in my arms at Khe Sanh in February 1968. I wrote to his widow, tried to tell her that Tom was a hero, that his last words were about his son. David became a lawyer, a good one. He fights for people the system tries to crush. He'll help you if you ask. The farmhouse is yours. The land is yours. The evidence is yours. What you do with it is your choice. But know this, I believed in you from the day you were born. I saw in you the kind of man this country needs, the kind who stands up when others sit down, who speaks truth when others stay silent. Don't let them make you afraid, Jack. Fear is how they win. Keep Danny safe. He's the future. He's the reason any of this matters. Semper Fi, Grandpa Frank. Jack read the letter 3 times, his hands shaking more with each reading. When he finally set it down on the table, the world had shifted in fundamental ways he was only beginning to understand. His grandfather had not been a simple machinist who tinkered in his workshop. Frank Harrison had been an inventor working on classified military technology. He had created something revolutionary that powerful people had stolen and buried. And William Hartley, the man who had married into Jack's family, who was now threatening to take Danny away, had been the one who destroyed Frank's life's work. Jack stood up and walked to the window, looking out at the parking lot where Patricia's Mercedes had been idling a few hours ago. Somewhere out there in a mansion with more rooms than Jack had ever lived in, William Hartley was probably sleeping soundly, secure in the knowledge that his money and his lawyers could solve any problem. The man had no idea that his crimes were about to be exposed, that the grandson of the man he had betrayed was reading the evidence that could destroy him. Jack thought about the farmhouse, 15 acres outside Asheville, that he had never visited. He thought about the safe Frank had mentioned, the documents hidden there for 50 years, waiting for someone brave enough to use them. He thought about his grandfather's words, make them pay. Not for me, but for every soldier who died because corrupt men chose oil profits over American lives. The rent was due in 2 weeks. The medical bills were piling up. Patricia Hartley was preparing to file for custody. Jack's job at the auto shop barely covered their basic expenses, and he had exactly $418 to face down a family worth millions in a conspiracy that had been buried for half a century. But he also had something they didn't have. He had the truth. He had evidence. And he had nothing left to lose except his son, and that was something he would never allow anyone to take from him. Jack returned to the kitchen table and picked up his phone. His fingers found Sarah Mitchell's number, the librarian who had brought her daughter Emma to the funeral. Sarah had mentioned that her brother was a lawyer who specialized in helping veterans. Jack hadn't thought much about it at the time, but now Frank's letter had given that casual comment new significance. Trust David Mitchell. His father died in my arms. It was late past 11 o'clock, but Jack dialed anyway. The phone rang 4 times before Sarah's voice came through, slightly worried the way people sound when they get unexpected calls after dark. Jack, is everything all right? Is Danny okay? We're fine, Jack said, surprised at how steady his voice sounded. But I need to ask you about your brother, the lawyer. You said he helps veterans. There was a pause, and Jack could hear the shift in Sarah's tone when she spoke again, moving from concern to curiosity. David, yes, he specializes in veterans' rights and patent law. Why, my grandfather left me something, Jack said carefully. Something important, something dangerous, and I think I'm going to need help. What kind of something? Jack looked at the letter on the table, at the wooden box with the purple heart, at his sleeping son, who deserved better than poverty and constant fear. He thought about Frank Harrison, 22 years old, and terrified in the jungles of Vietnam, watching his sergeant die. He thought about Frank, at 40, creating technology that could save lives only to have it stolen by men who cared more about money than honor. He thought about himself at 37, working double shifts to keep food on the table and a roof over their heads, while rich people plotted to take away the only thing that mattered. The kind that could change everything, Jack said finally. Can you give me his number? I need to talk to him as soon as possible. Sarah was quiet for a moment, and then she said, I'll do better than that. I'll call him tonight. David's been waiting for a case like this his whole career. He'll want to meet with you right away. After they hung up, Jack sat in the dark apartment with only the light from the street lamps filtering through the thin curtains. Danny was sleeping, peacefully unaware that his father had just made a decision that would put them both in the crosshairs of powerful people who had already proven they would destroy anyone who threatened their interests. But Jack felt something he hadn't felt in 3 years, not since Claire had died and left him alone with a 9-year-old son and a mountain of debt. He felt purpose. He felt direction. He felt like maybe, just maybe, his grandfather's faith in him had not been misplaced. Tomorrow he would drive to the farmhouse and find the safe. He would open it with his mother's birthday, and he would see with his own eyes the evidence that Frank had preserved. He would learn the full truth about Project Eternal Power and William Hartley's betrayal. And then he would do what Frank had been too afraid to do. He would fight back. Jack walked quietly to the couch where Danny slept and adjusted the blanket that had slipped down, tucking it carefully around his son's shoulders. The boy stirred slightly, but didn't wake, his face peaceful in sleep, innocent of the battles that were coming. I'm going to fix this, Jack whispered. I'm going to make sure you have the life you deserve, the life great-grandpa Frank wanted for all of us. And I'm going to make the people who hurt him answer for what they did. Outside, the rain had stopped, and through a break in the clouds, a few stars were visible, distant and cold, but somehow reassuring. Jack stood at the window for a long time, watching those stars and thinking about his grandfather's letter and the choice he had made. The path ahead was dangerous. The odds were terrible. The enemies were powerful and ruthless. But Jack Harrison had served his country for 8 years. He had faced Taliban fighters in Afghanistan and lived to tell about it. He had watched his wife die by inches and somehow found the strength to keep going for their son. He was not afraid of William Hartley or his lawyers or his money. He was afraid of failing Danny. He was afraid of breaking the promise he had made to Claire. He was afraid of letting his grandfather down one more time. But fear was how they won. Frank had written, and Jack Harrison was done being afraid. The morning sun cast long shadows through the pine trees as Jack's Ford F-150 climbed the winding gravel road toward his grandfather's farmhouse. Danny sat in the passenger seat with a notebook open on his lap, sketching the mountains that rose in layers of blue and purple against the October sky. The boy had been quiet since they left Asheville an hour ago, processing the previous night's conversation about what they were going to find, what it might mean, what they were about to uncover. Jack gripped the steering wheel tighter as the road narrowed, branches scraping against the truck's sides with sounds like fingernails on metal. He had only been to this property once before, maybe 20 years ago, when his grandfather was still relatively healthy, still working in that mysterious workshop behind the house. Jack remembered Frank as a man of few words, but many projects, always tinkering with something, always lost in thought about problems only he could see. The farmhouse appeared around a bend, like something from a forgotten photograph. It was a single-story structure with a peaked roof and a wraparound porch that sagged on one side where the support posts had rotted through. The white paint had peeled away in long strips, exposing gray wood beneath, and several windows were boarded over with plywood that had warped and split from years of weather. Tall grass grew wild around the foundation, and saplings had taken root in the gutters. But Jack noticed other things too. The stone foundation looked solid despite decades of neglect. The roof, though patched in places, showed signs of careful maintenance. The bones of the house were good, built by someone who understood construction, who had planned for longevity, even if he hadn't lived long enough to see those plans fulfilled. Behind the main house, perhaps 50 yards back, stood the workshop Frank had mentioned in his letter. Unlike the farmhouse, this building looked almost fortress-like. Concrete walls, small windows with bars, a metal roof that showed minimal rust. The door was steel, painted in industrial gray, secured with a military-grade padlock that gleamed newer than everything else around it. Jack parked the truck and climbed out slowly, his boots crunching on the gravel driveway. The October air was cool and carried the smell of pine sap and rotting leaves. Somewhere in the woods, a crow called out, harsh and insistent, and then went silent. Danny emerged from the passenger side and stood close to his father, looking at the farmhouse with the wide eyes of a child encountering something from a storybook. This was Great-Grandpa Frank's house. For 40 years, Jack confirmed. He pulled the keys from his pocket, the ones the lawyer had given him, along with the deed and the stack of back taxes he owed. Your grandmother grew up here. Your mother spent summers here when she was young, before her parents got rich and decided rural life was beneath them. They walked together toward the front porch, testing each step before putting their full weight down. The boards creaked, but held. Jack fitted the old brass key into the lock, feeling it catch and turn with surprising smoothness, as if Frank had kept this mechanism oiled even as everything else fell into disrepair. The door swung inward on hinges that protested with a sound like a sigh. Inside, the air was stale and thick with dust that danced in the shafts of sunlight coming through the cracks in the boarded windows. The furniture was still there, covered in old sheets that had turned gray with time. A stone fireplace dominated one wall, its mantel cluttered with framed photographs that Jack moved closer to examine. There was Frank as a young Marine, impossibly young, maybe 19 or 20, standing with 4 other men in front of a jungle backdrop. Their faces were hard despite their youth eyes that had seen things no teenager should see. There was Frank's wedding photo, him in a suit that didn't quite fit, standing next to a woman with kind eyes and a gentle smile. Jack's grandmother, dead now for almost 40 years. There were photos of Jack's mother as a child, as a teenager, as a young woman on her wedding day. And there, in a simple wooden frame, was a photo Jack had never seen before. Frank, in his late 40s, standing in what looked like a laboratory with banks of equipment and testing apparatus behind him. He was holding something, a device about the size of a car battery, with cables running from it to meters and oscilloscopes. The photo was labeled in Frank's handwriting, Project Eternal Power, DARPA, Facility Fort Belvoir, March 1973. Danny picked up another photo, this one showing a much older Frank standing in front of the workshop with his arms crossed, a slight smile on his weathered face. He looks happy here. He was home, Jack said quietly. After everything that happened to him, this was the only place he felt safe. They explored the rest of the house together, moving through rooms that told the story of a solitary life lived with military precision. The kitchen had dishes stacked neatly in the cupboard, matching all clean despite the dust. The bedroom held a single bed made with hospital corners, a footlocker at its base, a simple dresser with photos of family. The bathroom fixtures were old but functional. Everything was organized, labeled maintained, as well as one aging man could manage alone. In what had once been a second bedroom, they found Frank's personal library. Shelves lined every wall floor to ceiling, filled with technical manuals, engineering textbooks, military history, biographies of inventors. There were bound volumes of scientific journals from the 1960s and 70s, dog-eared and annotated in the margins with Frank's careful notes. There was a desk positioned beneath the window, its surface covered in more photographs and a leather-bound journal. Jack opened the journal carefully, feeling the brittleness of the pages. The entries dated back to 1968, starting with Frank's deployment to Vietnam. The early passages were brief, almost clinical descriptions of patrols and firefights and the grinding daily fear of combat. But then the tone shifted as Frank began to describe the problems he saw, the challenges that plagued military operations in a jungle war fought far from supply lines. February 12th, 1968, Jack read aloud. Lost Johnson today. Took a round meant for me when we were trying to extract wounded from the field hospital. The generators had failed again, no power for the surgical lights, doctors operating with flashlights while men bled out on tables. This war is wrong in so many ways, but my brother's dying because we can't keep the goddamn lights on. That's something I can fix. That's something that matters. When I get home, I'm going to build a battery that never fails, that can run for days on a single charge, that can be recharged in minutes. I'm going to make sure no more soldiers die in the dark. Danny listened intently, his young face serious. Did he do it? Did he build it? Let's find out, Jack said, closing the journal and heading toward the door. The workshop was locked with two separate mechanisms, the modern padlock on the outside and an older deadbolt that required a different key. Jack worked both locks open and pulled the heavy steel door, feeling it swing on hinges that moved silently despite their age. Frank had maintained this building with care, keeping it secure, keeping it ready for the day when someone would finally come looking for what he had hidden. Inside the workshop was a revelation. Fluorescent lights flickered to life when Jack found the switch, revealing a space that looked more like a professional laboratory than a rural mechanic's garage. Workbenches lined three walls, their surfaces covered with testing equipment, soldering stations, measurement tools. Pegboards held wrenches and screwdrivers and specialized instruments arranged with military precision. Filing cabinets stood in one corner, each drawer labeled with technical specifications and dates. But what drew Jack's attention was the far wall, the one Frank had mentioned in his letter. It looked like any other wall at first glance, painted the same industrial gray as the rest of the workshop. But when Jack examined it more closely, running his hands along the surface, he found what he was looking for. A seam barely visible, outlining a section about 4 feet wide and 6 feet tall. He pressed where the letter had told him to press, and a panel swung inward on hidden hinges, revealing a space beyond. The room behind the false wall was smaller, maybe 10 feet by 10 feet, and dominated by a massive gun safe that stood against the back wall. The safe was military surplus, the kind designed to withstand explosives and cutting torches, with a combination lock that gleamed under the workshop lights. Jack's hands trembled slightly as he spun the dial, entering the numbers Frank had told him to use. His mother's birthday. Month, day, year. The lock clicked with each number, and when he entered the final digit and pulled the handle, the heavy door swung open with a whisper of well-oiled metal. Inside the safe, organized with the same precision Frank had applied to everything in his life, were the documents that would change everything. Jack pulled them out one by one, laying them across the workbench, while Danny watched with quiet fascination. There were technical drawings, dozens of them, showing battery designs decades ahead of their time. Detailed schematics of lithium metal composite cells, energy density, calculations, thermal management systems, charging protocols. Jack had worked on enough car batteries to recognize the basic principles, but this was something else entirely. This was innovation that belonged in a classified research facility, not a rural workshop. There were patents officially filed with the United States Patent Office dated 1972 and 1973. Frank's name was listed as the inventor, but the assignee was listed as DARPA, the Defense Advanced Research Projects Agency. The patent numbers were clearly marked, everything legal and proper and documented. There were correspondence files, letters between Frank and various DARPA officials, discussing the progress of Project Eternal Power. The early letters were enthusiastic, full of praise for Frank's breakthrough work. Your energy density figures exceed anything we've seen in the field. One letter read, If you can achieve these results in field testing, you'll revolutionize military logistics. But then the tone changed. Later letters from 1973 and early 1974 became more cautious, more bureaucratic. References to strategic concerns and policy considerations, and the need to balance innovation with existing infrastructure. And then came the letter that ended everything. Dear Sergeant Harrison, it began signed by a General Harold Webb. After careful consideration of the broader strategic implications of Project Eternal Power, the Department of Defense has decided to discontinue this research program. Your work has been exemplary, and the technical achievements that are noteworthy. However, current analysis suggests that widespread adoption of independent power systems could create vulnerabilities in our strategic petroleum supply chain management. The recommendation to terminate this project came from Major William Hartley of Army Intelligence, who has conducted extensive liaison with our industrial partners. You will be contacted by legal counsel regarding the disposition of patents and materials. Your honorable service is appreciated. Jack read the letter twice, feeling his anger build with each word. Strategic Petroleum Supply Chain Management. That was the bureaucratic language they had used to bury revolutionary technology. That was how they had justified protecting oil company profits over soldiers' lives. But Frank had kept copies of everything, including things he wasn't supposed to have. At the bottom of the stack, Jack found a manila envelope marked personal insurance in Frank's handwriting. Inside was a small cassette tape, the kind used in old recording devices, and a typed transcript of what was on it. Jack found an old cassette player on one of the workbenches and loaded the tape with hands that shook slightly. Static crackled for a moment, and then voices emerged from the speaker, tinny but clear enough to understand. The first voice was Frank's younger but recognizable. Major Hartley, I appreciate you meeting with me, but I don't understand why we're terminating a project that's exceeded every performance goal. The second voice was smooth, educated, carrying the confidence of someone who had never been told no. Sergeant Harrison, let me be frank with you. Your invention works. It works too well. Do you understand what would happen if every military base in the world could generate its own power independently? What that would do to the petroleum industry, to the companies that supply generators and fuel, and all the infrastructure that currently powers our operations. It would save lives, sir. It would mean field hospitals could operate anywhere, anytime without worrying about supply lines. It would also cost certain people a great deal of money. People who have invested billions in the current system. People who have significant influence over Pentagon budget decisions. There was a pause, and then Frank's voice came back harder now, suspicious. Are you saying this project is being killed to protect oil company profits? I'm saying that national security is complex. Sergeant, energy independence sounds good in theory, but in practice it could destabilize relationships we've spent decades building. The petroleum supply chain is not just about fuel. It's about alliances, about leverage, about maintaining American power in a complicated world. And about making sure your family's company keeps its contracts, Frank said, his voice cold now. I looked into your background, Major. Hartley Industries holds $200 million in military petroleum supply contracts. Your father is the CEO. You're telling me this decision has nothing to do with protecting your family's business interests? The sound of a chair scraping footsteps. When Hartley spoke again, his voice had lost its professional veneer. Listen carefully, Harrison. This conversation never happened. You're going to sign the non-disclosure agreement our lawyers prepared. You're going to accept the severance package. You're going to retire quietly and forget about Project Eternal Power. If you don't, we'll bring charges against you for theft of government property, unauthorized retention of classified materials, and about 6 other felonies that will put you in Leavenworth for 20 years. Your wife is sick, isn't she? Cancer. Who's going to take care of her while you're in prison? Who's going to raise your daughter? These are the things you need to think about, Sergeant. Your family's safety could become a concern if you make the wrong choice here. The tape ended with a click that sounded like the closing of a cell door. Jack stood in the workshop, staring at the cassette player, feeling the full weight of what his grandfather had endured. Frank had been threatened, blackmailed, forced to choose between his life's work and his family's safety. And he had chosen his family, signing away the patents, accepting the money, living with that decision for 50 years. Danny had been listening to the tape with his eyes growing wider, his child's understanding of right and wrong struggling to process what he was hearing. Dad, that man threatened great-grandpa Frank. He said he'd put him in jail if he didn't give up his invention. That man, Jack said quietly, is William Hartley, your other great-grandfather, the man whose family wants to take you away from me. The boy was silent for a long moment, and then he said, "We can't let him win again. Great-grandpa Frank couldn't fight back because of his family, but we can fight back because of him." Jack looked at his son and saw the same determination he had seen in his grandfather's photos, the same stubborn refusal to accept injustice that had driven Frank to record that conversation, to hide these documents, to preserve the evidence even when he couldn't use it himself. 9 years old, and Danny already understood what mattered more than safety or comfort or the easy path. "Yes," Jack agreed, "we can fight back." He turned his attention to the final item in the safe, a large object covered with a canvas tarp. Jack pulled the tarp away carefully, revealing what lay beneath. It was a battery system, roughly the size of a commercial refrigerator, with modular cells arranged in rows, and a control panel covered in gauges and switches. A label on the side read, "EPS-7 Prototype, March 1974, Final Operational Test." Jack examined the device with the careful attention of a mechanic who understood machinery, even if he didn't fully grasp the advanced engineering. The construction was beautiful, precise, clearly built by someone who took pride in craftsmanship. Every connection was clean, every component properly secured, every wire labeled and color-coded. This wasn't a crude prototype thrown together in a rush. This was professional-grade work, the kind that belonged in a military research laboratory. Danny pointed to the control panel. "Does it still work after 50 years? "Only one way to find out," Jack said, locating the power switch among the controls. He took a breath and flipped it. For a long moment, nothing happened. Then a soft humming sound began, growing gradually louder, and lights on the control panel started to flicker to life one by one. Green indicators showing system status, charge levels, output capacity. The digital display's old LED technology, from an era before modern computers, glowed with steady numbers. Jack found a multimeter on the workbench and connected it to the output terminals, checking the voltage. The needle swung to 12.5 volts, rock steady, no fluctuation. He increased the load, connecting a work light that probably drew 100 watts. The light blazed to life, bright and constant, and the battery's output didn't waver. "It works," Danny whispered, his voice filled with awe. "After 50 years, it still works." Jack disconnected the test equipment and stood back, looking at the prototype with new understanding. This wasn't just a battery. This was proof that his grandfather had created something revolutionary, something that could have changed military operations, something that had been deliberately suppressed by men who valued profit over innovation and power over progress. The workshop door swung open behind them, and Jack spun around, his hand instinctively reaching for something to use as a weapon. But it was Sarah Mitchell who stood in the doorway, slightly out of breath from the walk-up from where she had parked her car behind Jack's truck. Her brother David stood beside her, a tall man in his mid-40s with short gray hair and sharp eyes behind rimless glasses. "Sarah called me last night," David said, extending his hand to Jack. "Told me you needed help with something important. I came as soon as I could." Jack shook the offered hand, feeling the firm grip of someone who meant what he said. "David Mitchell, your father was Tom Mitchell." David's expression shifted, surprise and something deeper flickering across his face. "You know about my father?" "My grandfather wrote me a letter," Jack said, pulling the folded pages from his pocket. "He said Tom Mitchell died in his arms at Khe Sanh in February 1968. Said your father's last words were about you, about wanting you to be a good man. Frank wrote to your mother, tried to help however he could." David took the letter Jack offered and read it slowly, his jaw tightening as he processed his father's final moments, as witnessed by Frank Harrison. When he finished, he looked up with eyes that held both old grief and new determination. "I never knew the details. Mom said a Marine had written to her, told her dad died bravely, but I never knew who. I've been looking for that letter for 20 years, ever since she passed, and I went through her things. Never found it." "Frank kept copies of important letters," Jack said. "If he wrote to your mother, there might be a copy in his files." They searched together through the filing cabinets, while Sarah kept Danny occupied examining the photos on the workshop walls. It took 20 minutes, but finally Jack found what they were looking for. A carbon copy of a letter dated March 1968 addressed to Mrs. Martha Mitchell. David read it standing in the middle of the workshop, and when he finished, he folded it carefully and put it in his pocket. "Thank you," he said simply. "This means more than you know. Now let me show you why I really asked you to come," Jack said, gesturing toward the prototype and the documents spread across the workbench. For the next hour, Jack walked David through everything they had found. The patents, the correspondence, the threatening letter from General Webb, the recording of William Hartley's blackmail. David listened without interrupting, making notes in a leather-bound book he pulled from his briefcase, his expression growing progressively more serious as the full scope of what he was hearing became clear. When Jack finished, David set down his pen and looked at the prototype, then at the documents, then at Jack. "This is the biggest case I've ever seen. If even half of this is provable in court, we're talking about a conspiracy that spans 50 years, involves government officials and defense contractors, and has cost taxpayers and soldiers immeasurable harm. William Hartley didn't just steal your grandfather's invention. He used his position in the military to kill a project that could have saved lives, all to protect his family's business interests." "Can we prove it?" Jack asked. "We have the patents showing Frank invented this technology. We have correspondence showing the project was successful. We have a recording of Hartley making explicit threats and admitting the decision was based on protecting oil industry profits. And we have a working prototype that demonstrates the technology is real and functional. Yes, Jack, we can prove it, but you need to understand what you're taking on. William Hartley is worth hundreds of millions of dollars. He has connections in Washington that go back decades. He has lawyers who specialize in making problems like this disappear. And he's already shown he's willing to use threats and intimidation to protect his interests. He's also threatening to take my son," Jack said. "His daughter-in-law visited yesterday, told me they were going to pursue custody because I'm poor and struggling. This isn't just about exposing what happened 50 years ago. This is about protecting my family now." David nodded slowly, understanding the stakes. "Then we fight on both fronts. We file a patent lawsuit alleging theft and seeking restitution for 50 years of profits. And we preempt their custody move by documenting that their threats are retaliation for you asserting your legal rights. Federal courts don't look kindly on people who use family court as a weapon in business disputes." Sarah had been listening quietly, but now she spoke up. "Jack, are you sure about this? David's right about how dangerous this could be. These people have resources and connections, and they've already proven they're willing to threaten veterans and their families." Jack looked at his son, who was examining Frank's Purple Heart medal that someone had left on the workbench. He thought about his grandfather, threatened and blackmailed into silence, forced to watch his life's work be buried while soldiers died in field hospitals that couldn't keep the power running. He thought about Claire dying in that hospital bed, making him promise to protect Danny from her family's corrupting influence. He thought about the stack of bills on his kitchen table and Patricia Hartley's cold assessment that he wasn't good enough to raise his own son. "I'm sure," Jack said. "My grandfather waited 50 years for someone to finish what he started. I'm not waiting another day." David smiled, the kind of smile a soldier gives before going into battle. "Then let's get to work. First thing we need to do is secure this evidence. Copy everything. Get it to a safe location. Make sure there are multiple backups. These people will try to make this disappear if they can. Second, we need to find other witnesses. Your grandfather mentioned Project Eternal Power had other engineers. We need to track them down, see if any of them are still alive and willing to testify. Third, we need to research what happened to Frank's patents after he signed them over. Did Hartley Industries just bury them, or have they been licensing the technology? If they've been making money off your grandfather's work, that's additional damages we can claim." They spent the rest of the day in the workshop methodically photographing every document, making digital copies of the recordings, taking detailed photos of the prototype from every angle. Sarah helped organize everything into chronological files, while Danny carefully labeled each item with the attention to detail he had inherited from his great-grandfather. As the sun began to set, casting long shadows through the workshop windows, David's phone rang. He answered it, listened for a moment, and his expression darkened. When he hung up, he looked at Jack with concern. "That was my office. William Hartley's lawyers just filed an emergency custody petition in family court. They're claiming you're mentally unstable financially incompetent, and potentially dangerous to Danny's welfare. The hearing is scheduled for 10 days from now. Jack felt something cold settle in his chest, but he kept his voice steady. What does that mean? It means they're moving fast, trying to take Danny before we can build our case against them. They're betting that a family court judge won't know or care about 50-year-old patent disputes, and that your current financial situation will be enough to sway the decision in their favor. We need to file our lawsuit immediately, establish the pattern of retaliation, and hope the federal judge will intervene to protect you from harassment while the bigger case is pending. Can we do that? File the lawsuit that fast? David looked at the evidence spread across the workbench, at the prototype humming softly in the corner, at the recording device that held William Hartley's own words condemning him. We can file it tonight. I'll work through the night if I have to. This case is too important to wait. They loaded everything into David's car, creating a mobile archive of Frank Harrison's life's work. As they prepared to leave, Jack took one last look around the workshop, imagining his grandfather spending decades here alone, maintaining this equipment, preserving this evidence, waiting for the day when someone would finally use it to seek justice. Danny tugged at his father's sleeve. Dad, can we come back? I want to learn more about what great-grandpa Frank built. We'll come back, Jack promised. This is our place now. Frank left it to us for a reason. As they drove away from the farmhouse, following David's car down the winding mountain road toward Asheville, Jack felt something shift in his chest. For 3 years since Claire's death, he had been surviving, just barely keeping his head above water, working double shifts and counting pennies and trying to hold together a life that kept threatening to fall apart. But now he had purpose. Now he had a mission that was bigger than just getting through another day. His phone rang as they reached the highway. The caller ID showed a number he didn't recognize. Jack answered cautiously. Mr. Harrison. The voice was male professional with an edge of threat beneath the courtesy. My name is Victor Kane. I work for Hartley Industries Security Division. Mr. William Hartley would like to speak with you about some property you recently acquired. He's willing to make a very generous offer for your grandfather's farmhouse and the surrounding land. $200,000 cash, closing within a week. That's 4 times what the property is worth. I suggest you take it. Jack glanced at Danny in the passenger seat, then back at the road ahead. Tell Mr. Hartley the property isn't for sale. Mr. Harrison, I don't think you understand the situation. You're in significant financial difficulty. You have a custody hearing in 10 days. Mr. Hartley is trying to help you. This money could solve a lot of your problems. Or create new ones, Jack said. Like I said, the property isn't for sale. There was a pause, and when Kane spoke again, the professional courtesy had evaporated. You're making a mistake. Mr. Hartley is a generous man when people cooperate, but he doesn't like being told no. Think about what's best for your son, Mr. Harrison. Think about his future. Jack ended the call without responding and pulled the truck over to the side of the highway, his hands shaking slightly with anger. $200,000 for property worth $50,000 offered the same day he discovered evidence that could destroy William Hartley. That wasn't a coincidence. That was damage control. They knew or suspected what he had found, and they were trying to buy it back before he could use it, which meant they were scared, which meant the evidence was even more dangerous than he had realized. Jack pulled back onto the highway and followed David's taillights through the gathering dark toward Asheville and lawyers and courtrooms in a battle that had been waiting 50 years to be fought. Behind them, the mountains faded into shadow, and somewhere in those mountains, Frank Harrison's farmhouse stood quiet and empty, keeping its secrets safe for one more night. But tomorrow, those secrets would become weapons. Tomorrow, the truth would finally begin to emerge from 50 years of burial. And tomorrow, William Hartley would learn what it meant to face a man who had nothing left to lose except his honor and his son. And those were things Jack Harrison would never surrender. The federal courthouse in Charlotte rose 12 stories into the November sky, its granite facade designed to project permanence and authority. Jack Harrison stood at the base of the painted-wide stone steps, his hand resting on Danny's shoulder, watching as television crews set up their cameras and reporters checked their microphones. The custody hearing had been postponed, pending the outcome of the federal case, a small victory that David Mitchell had secured through emergency motions and legal maneuvering that Jack barely understood but deeply appreciated. 3 weeks had passed since they discovered Frank's evidence in the workshop. 3 weeks of depositions and document review, and late nights in David's office, while Jack struggled to maintain his job at Miller's Auto Shop and keep Danny's life as normal as possible. 3 weeks of watching shadows, of checking over his shoulder, of wondering if every strange car in the parking lot was another Hartley Industries security contractor sent to intimidate him into silence. But they had also been 3 weeks of revelation. David had tracked down Dr. Raymond Cooper, the only surviving engineer from Project Eternal Power, living off-grid in the Montana wilderness. The old man had agreed to testify via video link, and his deposition had been devastating to Hartley's defense. Cooper had corroborated every detail of Frank's account, adding his own stories of threats and intimidation of colleagues who had died under suspicious circumstances of a conspiracy that had stretched from Pentagon offices to oil company boardrooms. They had also discovered something that changed the entire scope of the case. Hartley Industries hadn't just buried Frank's patents. They had been quietly licensing the technology for decades, making hundreds of millions of dollars while claiming the innovation as their own proprietary research. David's investigator, a former FBI agent named Marcus Stone, had uncovered licensing agreements with major defense contractors, automotive companies, and energy corporations, all paying Hartley Industries for battery technology that Frank Harrison had invented 50 years ago. Now they stood on the courthouse steps, about to present all of that evidence to federal Judge Patricia Morrison, a woman with a reputation for fierce intelligence and zero tolerance for corporate malfeasance. The gallery would be packed with veterans organizations that David had contacted, with military journalists covering the story of a Marine's stolen legacy, with activists who saw in Frank's case a symbol of everything wrong with the military-industrial complex, and with the Hartley family, who had arrived in 3 black Mercedes sedans and were now being escorted through a side entrance by security personnel. Sarah Mitchell appeared at Jack's elbow, her hand briefly touching his arm in a gesture of support that had become more frequent over the past 3 weeks. Their relationship had evolved slowly, carefully, 2 people who had both lost spouses learning to trust again. Nothing had been spoken aloud yet, but Danny had noticed, and Jack had seen the boy's approval in the small smile he gave when Sarah was around. "Marcus just texted," Sarah said quietly. "He's in position. If Hartley's people try anything, he'll be ready." Jack nodded. Marcus Stone had become their guardian angel over the past weeks, a former Navy SEAL who had served in the same theater as Jack during their Afghanistan deployments. When David had explained the case, Marcus had volunteered his services for free, citing the code that bound those who had served together. He was somewhere in the courthouse, now watching for threats, ready to intervene if Hartley's security people decided legal channels weren't moving fast enough. David emerged from the courthouse doors, his briefcase in one hand and a thick folder of documents in the other. He wore a dark gray suit that fit him well, his only concession to military heritage, a small pin on his lapel showing the Army JAG Corps insignia. "They're ready for us. Judge Morrison wants to start promptly at 9. They climbed the steps together, passing through security, where Jack had to remove his belt and watch while Danny's backpack was searched. The boy had insisted on bringing his great-grandfather's Purple Heart medal, carefully wrapped in a handkerchief, saying he wanted Frank to be present for what was about to happen. The security guard had handled it with appropriate reverence, a fellow veteran recognizing the significance of what he was holding. The courtroom was indeed packed, every seat in the gallery filled, and people standing along the back wall. Jack recognized some faces from the veterans' cemetery, where they had buried Frank, others from news coverage that had begun to build around the case. There were reporters with notepads and cameras, activists with buttons supporting military whistleblowers, and a contingent of older men wearing Marine Corps caps who had come to honor one of their own. And at the defendant's table sat William Hartley, 72 years old, but still commanding in his bearing, wearing a suit that probably cost more than Jack made in 3 months. Beside him sat 8 lawyers in matching dark suits, led by Margaret Walsh, a legendary corporate defense attorney whose name alone commanded 7-figure fees. They were arranged like a military formation, projecting the kind of overwhelming force that was supposed to make opponents surrender before the first shot was fired. But at the plaintiff's table sat only David Mitchell and his paralegal, a young woman named Rachel Chen, who had been working 18-hour days to organize the mountain of evidence they had compiled. And Jack Harrison, in the best suit he owned, bought secondhand for Claire's funeral, and now pressed and cleaned for this moment. And Danny sitting very straight in his chair, his great-grandfather's medal in his pocket. Judge Patricia Morrison entered from her chambers, and everyone rose. She was 68 years old with silver hair, pulled back in a severe bun, her face lined with the evidence of decades spent navigating the complexities of federal law. She had a reputation for being brilliant and impatient in equal measure, someone who could spot a weak argument from 100 yards and had no patience for lawyers who wasted her time. "Be seated," she said, her voice carrying easily through the courtroom despite its moderate volume. "We're here for Harrison versus Hartley Industries, case number 24-4321. This matter concerns allegations of patent theft, fraud, and unjust enrichment spanning 5 decades. I've read the briefs, and I'm ready to hear opening statements. Mr. Mitchell, you may proceed." David stood, buttoned his jacket with practiced precision, and walked to the podium positioned between the two tables. He didn't use notes. He had lived with this case every waking hour for 3 weeks, and the story was burned into his memory like a brand. "Your Honor, this case is about theft, but not the kind we usually see in this courtroom. This isn't about stolen money or embezzled funds or fraudulent business deals. This is about the theft of honor, the theft of innovation, and the theft of a veteran's legacy." Frank Harrison served his country in Vietnam as a Marine Corps infantryman. He saw combat at Khe Sanh and other battles whose names still carry weight among those who were there. He watched his brothers in arms die in field hospitals that couldn't keep the power running, that couldn't operate surgical equipment because generators failed, or fuel ran out, or supply lines were cut by enemy action. David paused, letting the courtroom absorb the image he had painted. Jack could see some of the older veterans in the gallery nodding, remembering their own experiences. When Sergeant Harrison came home from Vietnam, he didn't forget what he had seen. He went to work for DARPA, the Defense Advanced Research Projects Agency, and he spent 3 years developing battery technology that could have revolutionized military operations. His invention could power a field hospital for 72 hours as on a single charge and be recharged in 30 minutes. It used lithium metal composite cells decades before such technology became commercially viable. "It worked, Your Honor. We have the prototype and evidence still functional after 50 years. David turned slightly, gesturing toward where the EPS-7 prototype sat on a rolling cart beside the plaintiff's table, its control panel lights glowing softly. But Frank Harrison's invention was killed. Not because it didn't work, but because it worked too well. It threatened billions of dollars in oil industry profits, and a man named William Hartley, then a major in Army intelligence, made sure it never saw production. Major Hartley recommended that the Pentagon terminate Project Eternal Power, citing national security concerns. But the real reason, as we will prove, was that Hartley's family business held hundreds of millions of dollars in military petroleum supply contracts. His father was CEO of Hartley Industries, and the major was protecting the family fortune. Margaret Walsh rose from her seat. "Objection, Your Honor. Counsel is making allegations without foundation and engaging in inflammatory speculation." Judge Morrison looked at David with one eyebrow raised. "Mr. Mitchell, I assume you can substantiate these claims." "We have a recording, Your Honor, made by Frank Harrison in 1974 of William Hartley explicitly stating that the project was being terminated to protect oil industry interests and threatening Sergeant Harrison with court-martial if he didn't sign away his patents. We also have internal Hartley Industries documents showing the company has licensed Frank Harrison's technology for the past 30 years, generating over $800 million in revenue from patents they obtained through coercion and threats." The courtroom erupted in murmurs and whispered conversations. Judge Morrison's gavel came down with a sharp crack. "Order, Miss Walsh, your objection is noted but overruled. Continue, Mr. Mitchell." "Thank you, Your Honor. Frank Harrison was forced to choose between his life's work and his family's safety. He signed the non-disclosure agreement. He accepted $50,000 in severance pay. He retired to a farmhouse in the mountains and spent the next 50 years watching William Hartley and Hartley Industries profit from stolen innovation, while soldiers continued to die in conflicts around the world because the equipment they needed couldn't be powered in remote locations. Frank Harrison died last October at the age of 88, never having received justice or recognition for what he created. But before he died, he left evidence, all of it, every document, every recording, every schematic. He left it for his grandson, Jack Harrison, who sits here today asking this court to do what the Pentagon wouldn't do in 1974. Hold William Hartley accountable for theft, fraud, and the betrayal of a fellow veteran. David returned to his seat, and Margaret Walsh rose with the smooth confidence of someone who had won more cases than most lawyers ever tried. She was in her early 60s, impeccably dressed, her posture radiating the certainty of someone who had never met a problem that money and legal expertise couldn't solve. Your Honor, what Mr. Mitchell describes as theft was actually a legitimate business transaction conducted in accordance with all applicable laws and regulations. Frank Harrison was an employee of DARPA working on a government-funded project. The patents he generated belonged to the government, not to him personally. When the project was terminated for valid national security reasons, Sergeant Harrison was offered generous compensation and a non-disclosure agreement that protected classified information. He accepted that offer voluntarily. There was no coercion, no threats, no impropriety of any kind. Walsh's voice was smooth, reasonable, the kind of voice that made complex legal arguments sound simple and obvious. As for the allegations regarding licensing revenue, Hartley Industries has invested billions of dollars over the past 50 years developing and commercializing battery technology. Some of that technology may have been inspired by the foundational work done at DARPA, but inspiration is not theft. Every innovation builds on what came before. Mr. Harrison's claim that he deserves a share of Hartley Industries' profits is like claiming that the Wright brothers' heirs deserve money from every airplane ever built. It's absurd on its face, and this court should dismiss it as such. Judge Morrison made a note on her legal pad, her expression unreadable. Thank you, Ms. Walsh. Mr. Mitchell, call your first witness. The plaintiff calls Dr. Raymond Cooper, appearing via video conference from Missoula, Montana. A large screen descended from the ceiling, and after a moment of technical adjustment, Dr. Cooper's face appeared. He was 79 years old, his beard white and full, his eyes sharp despite his age. He wore a flannel shirt and sat in what looked like a rustic cabin with bookshelves visible behind him. After being sworn in remotely, David began his examination. Dr. Cooper, please tell the court about your involvement with Project Eternal Power. Cooper's voice was gravelly but strong, carrying the accent of rural Montana. I was one of 7 engineers assigned to the project from 1971 to 1974. Frank Harrison was the lead engineer, the genius behind the core innovation. My job was thermal management, making sure the batteries didn't overheat under heavy load. We were based at Fort Belvoir, working in a classified facility testing prototypes that exceeded every performance specification the military had given us. Did the technology work as designed? Better than designed. We achieved energy densities that civilian research wouldn't match for another 40 years. We could power a complete field surgical suite for 3 days straight, recharge it in less than an hour using a portable generator or solar panels. In combat testing, our batteries outperformed every other power system the military had by factors of 10 or more. We were going to revolutionize military logistics. What happened to the project? Cooper's face darkened, old anger flickering in his eyes. It was killed, terminated by direct order from the Pentagon. We were told it was a strategic decision that the technology posed security risks, but we all knew the real reason. Major William Hartley had been assigned as our Pentagon liaison, supposedly to help facilitate deployment. Instead, he spent his time meeting with oil industry lobbyists and generating reports about how independent power systems would undermine strategic petroleum relationships. Did Major Hartley ever make explicit statements about protecting oil industry interests? He did. I was present at a meeting in January 1974 where he told Frank Harrison directly that the technology threatened billions of dollars in oil revenue and that powerful people wanted it buried. He said that if we knew what was good for us, we'd sign the termination agreements and walk away quietly. Margaret Walsh rose. Objection, hearsay, and speculation about supposed conversations from 50 years ago. David held up a cassette tape. Your Honor, we have a recording of that exact conversation. Dr. Cooper's testimony is merely providing context for evidence that will be introduced momentarily. Judge Morrison nodded. Overruled. Continue, Dr. Cooper. What I saw was a brilliant invention being destroyed not because it didn't work, but because it worked too well. Frank Harrison should have won the Nobel Prize for what he created. Instead, he was threatened with court-martial and forced into silence. And I was a coward. I signed my non-disclosure agreement, took my severance PM, and fled to Montana, where I've been hiding ever since, too afraid of what Hartley might do if I spoke up. Why are you speaking up now? Cooper looked directly at the camera, his eyes fierce despite the technology between them. Because Frank Harrison is dead, and I'm old enough that I don't care what happens to me anymore. Because the truth matters more than my safety. And because that young man sitting in the courtroom with Frank's grandson deserves to hear from someone who was there, someone who watched William Hartley destroy a good man's life for money. David played the recording, then Frank's voice and William Hartley's voice emerging from the courtroom speakers with perfect clarity. The gallery was silent as Hartley's words filled the room, his casual admission that the project was being killed to protect oil profits, his explicit threat that Frank's family could be endangered if he didn't cooperate, his cold calculation of exactly how to pressure a veteran into surrendering his rights. When the recording ended, Judge Morrison sat very still for a moment, her face carved from stone. Ms. Walsh, I assume you'll want to cross-examine Dr. Cooper. Walsh approached the podium, but some of her earlier confidence had evaporated. Dr. Cooper, isn't it true that you signed a non-disclosure agreement that specifically forbids you from discussing Project Eternal Power? I did sign such an agreement under duress and threats, similar to those used against Frank Harrison. But you signed it nonetheless, correct? I did, and I've regretted it every day since. And now, 50 years later, you're violating that agreement in a lawsuit that could potentially earn you millions of dollars in damages. I'm not a plaintiff in this case, Ms. Walsh. I won't receive a penny from any settlement. I'm here because it's the right thing to do, even if it's 50 years late. Walsh tried several more approaches, attempting to undermine Cooper's credibility, but the old engineer was unshakable. He had lived with his guilt for half a century, and now that he had finally decided to speak, nothing was going to stop him from telling the truth. After Cooper's testimony concluded, David called Jack to the stand. Jack's hands were sweaty as he walked to the witness box and was sworn in, very aware of the packed gallery behind him, of Danny watching from the plaintiff's table, of William Hartley's cold stare from across the courtroom. David's questions were simple and direct, establishing Jack's relationship with Frank, the discovery of the evidence in the workshop, the impact of the stolen patents on the Harrison family's life. Jack spoke clearly, keeping his military bearing, refusing to let emotion crack his voice even when talking about his grandfather's death or the financial struggles that had defined the past 3 years. Then Margaret Walsh stood for cross-examination, and Jack braced himself for the attack he knew was coming. Mr. Harrison, you're currently employed as a mechanic, is that correct? Foreman at Miller's Auto Shop, and your annual salary is approximately $33,000 before taxes. That's correct. You have significant medical debt from your late wife's cancer treatment, $52,000 remaining, and you're currently facing eviction from your apartment due to unpaid rent. David stood. Objection relevance. Mr. Harrison's financial situation has nothing to do with whether Hartley Industries stole his grandfather's patents. Walsh turned to Judge Morrison. Your Honor, it goes directly to the plaintiff's motivation. Mr. Harrison is in desperate financial straits and stands to gain hundreds of millions of dollars if he wins this case. That's a powerful incentive to fabricate evidence or misrepresent the facts. I'll allow it, Judge Morrison said. But make your point quickly, Ms. Walsh. Walsh turned back to Jack, her expression sympathetic in a way that felt calculated. Mr. Harrison, isn't it true that William Hartley's family has offered to help you to provide financial support and educational opportunities for your son? They've threatened to take my son away through the courts, claiming I'm not fit to raise him because I'm poor. Or perhaps they're concerned that a 9-year-old boy is living in an apartment that's been condemned by building inspectors, that they genuinely want to help a struggling family member. Jack's jaw tightened. If they wanted to help, they could have done it any time in the past 3 years. Instead, they waited until I discovered evidence of their crimes, and then they tried to use my son as leverage to make me stay silent. That's not concern. That's blackmail. Walsh's expression hardened slightly. Strong words, Mr. Harrison. Do you have any evidence that the custody proceedings are related to your grandfather's patents? The timing speaks for itself. They filed for emergency custody the same day we informed their lawyers we had Frank's evidence. That's not coincidence. Walsh changed tactics. Mr. Harrison, have you ever been diagnosed with any mental health conditions, PTSD, from your military service, perhaps? David was on his feet immediately. Objection. This is outrageous and completely improper. Judge Morrison's eyes flashed with anger. Ms. Walsh, you will not use this courtroom to wage a custody battle or to attack a veteran's mental health. Unless you have actual evidence of something relevant to the patent claims, move on immediately or sit down. Walsh retreated, recognizing she had overstepped. No further questions. The trial continued through the afternoon with technical experts explaining the sophistication of Frank's battery designs, with patent attorneys analyzing the licensing agreements that Hartley Industries had signed with other companies, with accountants calculating the profits generated from technology that should have belonged to the Harrison family. The evidence was overwhelming, documented in ways that Walsh's team couldn't effectively counter, no matter how skilled their arguments. But the most powerful moment came when David called his final witness. The plaintiff calls Daniel Harrison. A murmur went through the courtroom as Danny stood up from the plaintiff's table, small in his dress shirt and tie, clutching the handkerchief with his great-grandfather's purple heart. He walked to the witness stand with careful steps, and the bailiff had to adjust the microphone down to accommodate his height when he was sworn in. David approached gently, his voice soft. Danny, do you understand why we're here today? Yes, sir. We're here because great-grandpa Frank invented something important and Mr. Hartley stole it. Did you know your great-grandfather well? Not really. I was little when he died, but my dad told me stories about him, about how he was a Marine, how he fought in Vietnam, how he saw his friends die and wanted to make something that would help soldiers. Dad said great-grandpa Frank was a hero twice, once in the war and once when he tried to make the world better. How do you feel about what happened to him? Danny thought about this carefully, his 9-year-old mind working to find the right words. I feel sad that he never got to see his invention help people. I feel angry that someone threatened him and made him give it away. But mostly I feel proud that he kept all the evidence safe, that he waited for someone who would be brave enough to fight back. He waited for my dad. Danny, Mr. Hartley's family wants you to come live with them. They say they can give you things your father can't afford. What do you think about that? Margaret Walsh stood quickly. Objection, Your Honor. The child is being asked to make statements about ongoing custody proceedings. But before Judge Morrison could rule, Danny spoke up in a clear voice that carried through the silent courtroom. I don't want to live with them. They don't care about me. They just want to stop my dad from telling the truth about what they did to great-grandpa Frank. My dad works really hard. We don't have a lot of money, but we have each other. And great-grandpa Frank said a man's worth isn't in his bank account. It's in what he builds and who he protects. My dad builds a good life for us, and he protects me. That's worth more than all Mr. Hartley's money. The courtroom was absolutely silent when Danny finished speaking. Even Walsh seemed momentarily at a loss for words. Judge Morrison was looking at the boy with an expression that might have been admiration, or might have been the recognition that something important had just been said. No further questions, David said quietly. Walsh approached for cross-examination, but her heart wasn't in it. Danny, has your father told you what to say today? No, ma'am. He told me to tell the truth, so that's what I'm doing. Do you understand that this trial could make your family very wealthy if you win? I understand that it could give us justice. Great-grandpa Frank didn't leave us his inventions so we could get rich. He left them so we could make sure the truth came out. Walsh had no more questions. Danny stepped down from the witness stand and returned to his seat, and Jack reached over to squeeze his shoulder gently, pride and love, nearly overwhelming his ability to maintain his composure. The trial concluded with closing arguments that seemed almost anticlimactic after Danny's testimony. David summarized the evidence, the recordings, the documents, the 50 years of profits that Hartley Industries had made from stolen technology. Walsh argued about legitimate business transactions and the complexity of patent law and the impossibility of knowing what would have happened if Project Eternal Power had been allowed to continue. But everyone in the courtroom knew the truth. They had heard it in William O. Hartley's voice on that recording, admitting explicitly that the project was being killed to protect oil profits. They had seen it in the documents showing decades of licensing agreements for technology that legally should have reverted to Frank Harrison. They had felt it in Dr. Cooper's testimony and in Danny's simple statement of what mattered most in life. Judge Morrison announced she would deliver her ruling at 9 o'clock the following morning, giving herself one night to consider the evidence and write her opinion. The courtroom emptied slowly, veterans stopping to shake Jack's hand, reporters shouting questions that David deflected with practiced ease. That night, Jack couldn't sleep. He lay in bed in the hotel room that David had insisted on booking for them, listening to Danny's soft breathing from the other bed, thinking about his grandfather and his wife and the long chain of choices that had led to this moment. He thought about Frank threatened into silence, forced to choose between his invention and his family. He thought about Claire dying in that hospital bed, making him promise to protect their son from her family's corruption. He thought about all the soldiers who had died in field hospitals over the past 50 years who might have survived if Frank's batteries had been allowed to save them. At 8:45 the next morning, they returned to the courthouse. The gallery was packed, again even more people than the previous day, now that word had spread about the dramatic testimony. Jack sat at the plaintiff's table with Danny beside him, Sarah behind them with her hand on Jack's shoulder, Marcus Stone standing against the back wall with his arms crossed and his eyes constantly scanning for threats. At precisely 9 o'clock, Judge Morrison entered and everyone rose. She carried a thick document, her written opinion, and her face was grave as she took her seat and arranged her papers. This case has required me to consider questions that go beyond patent law and intellectual property rights, she began. It has required me to think about honor, about the obligations we owe to those who serve our country, and about what happens when corporate greed is allowed to corrupt the institutions meant to protect us all. She looked directly at William Hartley, who sat very still at the defendant's table, his expensive lawyers arrayed around him like armor that was about to prove useless. Frank Harrison was a Marine who served his country in combat. He came home and served again by creating technology that could have saved American lives. He was rewarded for that service with threats, coercion, and the theft of his life's work. The evidence presented in this case is overwhelming and frankly damning. Mr. William Hartley used his position in the military to kill a revolutionary project because it threatened his family's business interests. He then forced Sergeant Harrison to sign away his rights under threat of imprisonment. And for the past 50 years, Hartley Industries has profited enormously from patents that were obtained through blackmail and intimidation. Judge Morrison paused, letting the weight of her words settle over the courtroom. The court finds in favor of the plaintiff on all counts. Frank Harrison's patents were illegally obtained, and all rights to those patents and their derivative technologies immediately revert to his heirs, Jack Harrison and Daniel Harrison. Furthermore, Hartley Industries is ordered to pay restitution for all profits generated from the use of this technology since 1974, which the court's accountants have calculated at $870 million adjusted for inflation. Additionally, punitive damages of $200 million are assessed against William Hartley personally and Hartley Industries for the willful and malicious theft of a veteran's intellectual property. Total judgment, $1,070 million. The courtroom exploded in noise, gasps, and shouts, and the sounds of reporters rushing for the doors to file their stories. Jack sat frozen, unable to process the numbers, unable to believe that the fight was actually over and they had won. Beside him, Danny was crying silently, tears streaming down his face, clutching his great-grandfather's Purple Heart medal. Judge Morrison's gavel cracked repeatedly until order was restored. Furthermore, the court notes that emergency custody proceedings were filed against Mr. Jack Harrison within hours of Hartley Industries being informed of this lawsuit. The timing is not coincidental. Any attempt to use family court as retaliation for legitimate legal claims is unconscionable and potentially criminal. The court is referring this matter to the State Bar Association for investigation of ethical violations by Hartley Industries Counsel and is issuing an order prohibiting any custody action against Jack Harrison for a period of no less than 2 years, by which time his financial situation will have stabilized sufficiently to moot any claims of inability to provide for his son. She looked at Jack with something that might have been respect. Mr. Harrison, your grandfather was right about you. He knew you would be brave enough to finish what he started. This court hopes that the technology Frank Harrison invented will finally be used for its intended purpose, helping people and honoring the sacrifice of those who serve. The gavel fell one final time and it was over. 50 years of injustice undone in a single morning. David was shaking Jack's hand. Sarah was hugging both him and Danny. Marcus was grinning from the back of the courtroom, and somewhere Frank Harrison's spirit could finally rest knowing that truth had prevailed. Outside the courthouse on those same granite steps where they had stood the previous morning, Jack faced a forest of cameras and microphones. David stood beside him managing the press conference with professional competence. But when the questions came, Jack answered them himself. "What will you do with this money?" a reporter asked. Jack looked at Danny, who was holding the Purple Heart medal and standing very straight despite his age. "We're going to do what my grandfather always wanted. We're going to manufacture his batteries and make them available to people who need them. Veterans who want energy independence. Rural families who can't afford high electricity bills. Remote military bases that still rely on vulnerable supply lines. We're going to make sure Frank Harrison's legacy is helping people, not just making us rich." "How do you feel about William Hartley?" Jack considered this carefully. "I feel sorry for him. He had a chance to be part of something great, something that could have changed the world. Instead, he chose money. He'll have to live with that choice and what it cost everyone else. That's punishment enough." 6 months later, on a warm April morning, Jack stood in front of the restored farmhouse that had once belonged to Frank Harrison. The building had been completely renovated, the sagging porch replaced with solid timber, the roof new, the windows clear and gleaming. Behind it, the workshop had been transformed into the Frank Harrison Innovation Center, a museum and research facility dedicated to preserving his legacy and continuing his work. Sarah stood beside Jack, her hand in his, an engagement ring gleaming on her finger. They had moved slowly, carefully, two people learning to trust again after loss. But when Jack had proposed the previous month standing in the workshop, where they had first discovered the evidence that changed everything, Sarah had said yes without hesitation. Danny was playing with Emma near the old oak tree where his great-grandfather had once sat on summer evenings, the two children laughing as they climbed the treehouse that Jack had built with his own hands. The medical debts were paid. The apartment in Asheville was a memory. The farmhouse was their home now, filled with family and hope and the promise of better days. A crowd had gathered for the dedication ceremony, veterans and journalists and representatives from military organizations that had embraced Frank's story. David Mitchell was there, having become not just a lawyer, but a true friend, someone bound to the Harrison family by shared purpose and the memory of fathers who had served together. Marcus Stone stood at the edge of the crowd, always watching, always ready to protect the people he had sworn to defend. And at the center of it all, in a place of honor in the museum, stood the EPS-7 prototype, still functioning after 51 years, its lights glowing steadily. Beside it was a plaque with Frank Harrison's photograph and the words, "Sergeant Frank Harrison, USMC, Purple Heart recipient, Vietnam veteran, inventor, and patriot. He fought for his country twice and never surrendered to those who valued profit over honor." Jack stepped up to the podium that had been set up for the occasion, and the crowd quieted. He had prepared remarks, but when he looked out at the faces of veterans who had come to honor Frank's memory, at the children who represented the future, at his own son holding Sarah's daughter's hand, the prepared words seemed inadequate. "My grandfather used to say that a man's worth isn't in his bank account." Jack began, his voice carrying across the crowd. "It's in what he builds and who he protects." Frank Harrison built technology that's going to help thousands of families achieve energy independence. He protected the evidence of what had been done to him, preserving it for the day when someone would be brave enough to use it. And in doing so, he protected something more important than patents or money. He protected the truth. Jack paused, looking at the farmhouse, at the workshop, at the land that had sheltered Frank's secrets for so long. Today, we're not just dedicating a museum or launching a company. We're making a promise, the same promise Frank made when he came home from Vietnam. That we will use our talents and our resources to make the world better. That we will stand up to those who choose profit over people. That we will never forget the soldiers who gave everything or let their sacrifices be buried by those who profit from war without ever risking anything themselves. The crowd applauded, and Jack stepped back from the podium. Danny ran up to join him, Sarah following more slowly, and the three of them stood together, looking at the farmhouse that had once been a burden and was now a symbol of justice, delayed but finally achieved. William Hartley had declared bankruptcy 3 months earlier, his fortune consumed by the judgment and the subsequent SEC investigations that had uncovered decades of additional fraud. His son Richard had taken over what remained of Hartley Industries, and to his credit had reached out to Jack to discuss a partnership bringing Frank's technology to market through established channels. Jack had agreed on the condition that every product carried Frank Harrison's name and that a portion of all profits went to veteran support organizations. The world was changing slowly but measurably. The first production run of Harrison Energy Systems was already in deployment at military bases in remote locations, proving that Frank's vision of independent power had been right all along. Orders were coming in from humanitarian organizations, from rural cooperatives, from developing nations that saw in this technology a chance to leapfrog expensive infrastructure investments and bring electricity to communities that had never had reliable power. And every night when Jack tucked Danny into bed in the restored farmhouse, he would sometimes catch a scent of machine oil and pine sap that reminded him of his grandfather's workshop. He would stand at the window looking out at the mountains that stretched to the horizon, and he would think about Frank working alone all those years, preserving evidence, waiting for someone to carry his fight forward. "We did it, Grandpa," Jack would whisper to the darkness. "We finished what you started. You can rest now." And somewhere in those mountains, in the wind that rustled through the pine trees and the stars that blazed overhead in the clear night sky, Frank Harrison's spirit finally found the peace that had eluded him for 50 years. His invention was helping people. His name was honored. His sacrifice was recognized. And his family, 3 generations bound by love and honor and the stubborn refusal to accept injustice, had proven that truth, no matter how long it was buried, would eventually find its way into the light. The last promise had been kept.